The courtroom was completely silent. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Everyone knew this was the decisive moment. Michael Carter, a 42-year-old mechanic, was about to hear the verdict that could destroy his life forever. He kept his head up, but his cuffed hands trembled. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it echoed through the entire room. "The jury has reached a verdict." Those words hit him like a hammer to the chest. Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But when he looked at the jurors, his stomach dropped. None of them would meet his eyes. That was never a good sign. The judge cleared his throat and asked, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreman nodded and handed a folded piece of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The entire courtroom held its breath. In the front row, Prosecutor Vanessa Lowell allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She already knew what was coming. She had spent months gathering evidence, building an airtight case. To her, Michael was guilty, and nothing that happened now could change that. But at the back of the courtroom, a small girl clutched a stuffed rabbit so tightly that her tiny fingers had turned white. 7-year-old Emily Carter watched everything, unblinking. She didn't fully understand what a trial meant, but she knew one thing. If the judge said the wrong word, she would never see her father again. Michael closed his eyes for a brief moment. He wanted to believe justice would be served, but everything was against him. If this was his last moment of freedom, he wanted to remember his daughter's face. The judge unfolded the paper. For the crime of first-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant. Before he could finish, a small voice rang out through the courtroom. "My dad is innocent." Shock rippled through the room like a lightning strike. Jurors exchanged glances, the prosecutor's smirk vanished, and even the judge hesitated for a split second. "Who said that?" the judge asked, looking over his glasses. All eyes turned to Emily. The little girl had stood up on her seat, still holding her stuffed rabbit close to her chest. Her big blue eyes were filled with emotion, but her voice didn't waver. "My dad didn't kill anyone. And I can prove it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. People whispered to one another, stunned by what they had just heard. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Michael stared at his daughter, his mind racing. What was she saying? What did she know? His lawyer, Claire Jennings, stood quickly. "Your Honor, I request that this witness be heard." Vanessa Lowell scoffed, crossing her arms. "This is ridiculous. The child is obviously making up a story to save her father." But Emily didn't even glance at the prosecutor. She took a deep breath, turned to the judge, and said something that made the entire courtroom freeze. "I saw the real killer, and they're in this room." Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. No one moved. No one even breathed. Michael felt a chill crawl down his spine. What was Emily about to reveal? For a moment, the courtroom was paralyzed. It was as if Emily's words had sucked all the air from the room. The judge sat frozen, the jurors exchanged uneasy glances, and Michael Carter, still seated at the defendant's table, felt his pulse hammering in his throat. Did she just say she saw the real killer? The weight of those words crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had spent months locked in a cell, drowning in accusations, but in just a few seconds, his 7-year-old daughter had thrown everything into uncertainty. Vanessa Lowell, the prosecutor, was the first to react. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh and slammed her hand against the table. A calculated move. She wanted control of the room again. "This is a farce, Your Honor," she declared, her voice edged with frustration. "Are we really entertaining the testimony of a child who has clearly been coached? This is a murder trial, not a bedtime story." Michael clenched his fists under the table. Coached? He had barely seen Emily since his arrest. How could anyone believe she was making this up? He turned to his lawyer, Claire Jennings, who was already on her feet, her sharp eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution claims my client's guilt is undeniable, yet a key witness, his own daughter, has just stated she saw someone else that night. Are we really going to silence her without even hearing what she has to say?" A deep murmur rippled through the audience. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, cameras clicked, and even some jurors shifted in their seats. This wasn't supposed to happen. The case had been clear-cut, until now. Emily, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, took a shaky breath but didn't step down. Her small fingers tightened around the toy as she turned to face the judge directly. "I wasn't sleeping that night," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I heard noises. I got scared, so I looked through the stairs. I saw someone leaving our house. But it wasn't my dad." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a muffled curse from somewhere in the back. Michael's vision blurred for a second. His daughter had seen someone else. Someone had been there. And all this time, no one had thought to ask her. The judge raised his gavel and banged it against the bench, demanding order. His face, once stern and unreadable, now showed something else: hesitation. Doubt. "Enough. The court will recess for 20 minutes. Bailiff, escort the child and her guardian to my chambers immediately." Emily looked over at her father as the bailiff approached. For the first time since his arrest, Michael saw something he hadn't dared to feel in months: hope. The judge's chambers were smaller than the grand courtroom, but the tension inside was just as thick. Emily sat in a large leather chair, her stuffed rabbit resting in her lap. Across from her, Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his fingers interlocked, studying her carefully. Claire Jennings sat beside Emily, ready to intervene if needed. The bailiff stood by the door, and in the far corner, Vanessa Lowell had her arms crossed, clearly fuming at the fact that this conversation was even happening. The judge cleared his throat before speaking. "Emily, I need you to be very honest with me. You said you saw someone that night. Can you tell me exactly what you remember?" The little girl clutched her rabbit tighter, her small fingers pressing into the soft fabric. She looked down for a moment, as if searching for the right words, then took a deep breath. "I couldn't sleep. I heard something downstairs. I got scared, so I went to look." Claire leaned in slightly. "And what did you see?" Emily's grip on the rabbit tightened. "There was a man, but it wasn't my dad." A heavy silence filled the room. Michael, sitting in his holding cell across the courthouse, had no idea that his daughter was now the key to his freedom. Vanessa Lowell let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we are giving too much weight to the memory of a child who was barely awake in the middle of the night. Her recollection could be distorted or influenced." Judge Reynolds shot her a sharp look. "Prosecutor Lowell, I will determine the reliability of this testimony, not you." Emily swallowed hard but didn't back down. Her small voice didn't waver. "He was wearing a dark jacket. I couldn't see his face, but I saw his hands. He had something shiny in them. Like a knife." Claire's breath caught in her throat. The victim had been stabbed. That was a key detail, something Emily couldn't have known unless she had really seen it. Judge Reynolds sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk in thought. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I will allow a motion for new evidence." Claire exhaled sharply. That was exactly what they needed. But Vanessa Lowell's jaw tightened. This case was supposed to be closed. Now, thanks to a 7-year-old, everything was falling apart. The weight of Emily's words still lingered in the air as Judge Reynolds approved the motion for new evidence. Vanessa Lowell sat stiffly in her chair, her nails digging into the legal pad in front of her. This case was supposed to be over. The evidence had been stacked perfectly, the jury had been convinced, and Michael Carter was meant to be found guilty. But now, thanks to a 7-year-old, everything was falling apart. Michael sat alone in his holding cell, staring at the cold concrete floor. He had spent every day preparing himself for the worst. His freedom had felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life. And then, in the span of minutes, his daughter had turned everything upside down. Had Emily really seen someone? Or was this just the desperate plea of a little girl who didn't want to lose her father? He didn't know what to believe anymore. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of keys jingling outside the cell. The door creaked open, and Claire Jennings stepped in, her expression unreadable at first. But then he saw it, that spark of determination in her eyes. It was a look he hadn't seen since the beginning of the trial. "We have a shot, Michael." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with his hands. "You believe her? You really believe Emily saw someone?" Claire nodded without hesitation. "I do. And I think the prosecution does too. That's why Vanessa Lowell is panicking. If Emily saw someone else, it means the investigation was flawed. It means the real killer is still out there. And if we can prove that, then everything changes." Michael felt his heart pounding. Could it really be possible? He had been so consumed by his own fear, his own hopelessness, that he hadn't dared to think about what came next. If Emily was right, if there was another person out there, then who was it? And why had the police been so sure it was him? Meanwhile, Emily was being escorted home under police protection. She sat in the back seat of the unmarked vehicle, hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly. The officer driving tried to make small talk, but she barely heard him. Her mind was still in that courtroom, in that moment when she had stood up and spoken the truth. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But as they pulled up to the house, something felt wrong. A car was parked across the street, engine running, headlights dimmed. It hadn't been there before. The driver wasn't moving, just sitting in the shadows, watching. Emily's fingers gripped the rabbit even tighter. She wasn't sure why, but deep down, she knew. Whoever she had seen that night, knew she had seen them too. Claire Jennings sat at her desk long after the courthouse had emptied for the night. The dim light from her desk lamp cast sharp shadows across the scattered case files, photographs, and witness statements. She had spent months preparing Michael's defense, but this was different. Emily's testimony had cracked open something nobody had been willing to question before. If she had seen another person that night, then the police had made a mistake. Or worse, they had ignored the truth. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion threatening to pull her under, but then her eyes landed on a photograph she had seen dozens of times before. It was from the crime scene, the back alley behind Michael's former workplace where his boss had been murdered. The image was brutal, a pool of dark blood on the pavement, the victim's body slumped against a dumpster, the murder weapon lying just inches away. But Claire wasn't looking at the knife this time. Her focus shifted to something else, something in the corner of the image. A glove. It had been marked in the evidence log, but dismissed early in the investigation. The police had concluded that it wasn't relevant, just another piece of debris in a dirty alley. But something about that assumption gnawed at her. If Emily had seen someone holding a knife that night, then whoever it was could have been wearing gloves. She grabbed the forensic report and scanned it. The police had tested the inside of the glove and found no DNA, but Claire knew they had overlooked something crucial. They never tested the outside, she whispered to herself, her pulse quickening. If the real killer had worn it, then there was a chance their skin cells had been left behind. It was a long shot, but at this point, Michael Carter's life depended on long shots. Without wasting another second, she drafted a motion requesting the evidence to be re-examined. At 6:15 a.m., she was the first person at the courthouse, handing the motion directly to Judge Reynolds. He read it carefully, tapping his fingers against the desk. Then, much to Claire's surprise, he gave a small nod. Motion granted. The glove will be sent for additional testing immediately. By noon, the results were in. And they changed everything. There was DNA on the glove. But it wasn't Michael Carter's. Claire read the forensic report twice, her hands shaking. The DNA belonged to a man named Gregory Barnes. Her stomach twisted. Barnes had worked at the same company as Michael. He had been fired just months before the murder after a violent outburst. He had a criminal record, aggravated assault, breaking and entering, multiple arrests for violent behavior. She didn't hesitate. Clutching the report, she stormed into Vanessa Lowell's office and slammed the paper down on her desk. "Explain this." Vanessa's eyes scanned the document, her confident posture slowly stiffening as she reached the name at the bottom of the report. She looked up, her voice quieter than before. "Where is Barnes now?" That was the moment they both realized. Nobody knew. Gregory Barnes had vanished. Claire Jennings felt her pulse quicken as she stepped out of Vanessa Lowell's office, the forensic report still gripped tightly in her hand. The name Gregory Barnes burned in her mind like a neon sign. How had no one noticed him before? More importantly, how had he slipped through the cracks so easily while Michael Carter had been thrown behind bars without hesitation? She pushed open the heavy courthouse doors, letting the cool morning air hit her face. This case had just taken a turn no one had expected. A new suspect, fresh DNA evidence, and a growing suspicion that this wasn't just a simple mistake, it was something deeper. She didn't waste a second. Pulling out her phone, she dialed the number of Detective Harris, the lead investigator who had built the case against Michael. If anyone had answers, it was him. The phone rang 3 times before he finally picked up. "Jennings. Harris, I need you to find someone." A long pause. "Who?" "Gregory Barnes. We have forensic evidence placing him at the crime scene." Silence. Then a deep sigh. "Jennings, you don't want to go down this road." Claire stopped in her tracks. Something about his tone made the hairs on her arms stand up. "What the hell does that mean?" Harris exhaled again, like he was deciding how much to say. "It means you don't know what you're messing with. Just let this case play out. Carter's already guilty in the public eye. Even if you find Barnes, it won't change anything." Claire clenched her jaw. What was he implying? That it didn't matter if Michael was innocent? "You're telling me that even with DNA evidence proving another suspect was there, we should ignore it?" Another pause. Then, Harris lowered his voice. "I'm telling you that you don't know who you're dealing with." And then, before she could press him further, he hung up. Claire stared at her phone, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Something was very, very wrong. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched bowl of cereal. Her mother, Lisa, kept glancing toward the window, eyes flickering with unease. Emily hadn't been able to sleep since she testified. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that shadowy figure from that night. The way they had moved. The way the streetlight had briefly illuminated something in their hand. A knife. She had told the truth. She knew she had. So why did it still feel like something bad was about to happen? Lisa pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. The same car from the night before was still there. Dark-tinted windows. Engine off. The figure inside hadn't moved in hours. Her stomach twisted into knots. Whoever was inside that car, they weren't just watching. They were waiting. Claire Jennings had spent years in courtrooms, facing ruthless prosecutors, skeptical judges, and stubborn jurors, but nothing had ever made her skin crawl quite like her conversation with Detective Harris. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Those words echoed in her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as she processed everything. The DNA from the glove at the crime scene didn't match Michael Carter. It belonged to Gregory Barnes, a man with a history of violence and a motive to kill. That should have been enough to at least reconsider the case, but instead, Harris had practically told her to drop it. "Why? Claire didn't believe in coincidences. If Barnes had been overlooked, maybe it wasn't by accident. Maybe someone had wanted it that way. Her fingers moved instinctively, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a groggy voice answered. "Claire? Do you have any idea what time it is? I need a favor, Wes." Wes Carter, Michael's younger brother, had once been a cop. That was before he left the force under murky circumstances. Claire knew he still had connections, the kind of people who could find information not listed in official police reports. "It's been a long time since you called me, Jennings." "This about Michael?" "Yeah. I need everything you can find on Gregory Barnes. Every arrest, every charge, and, most importantly, where he is now." A pause. Then, a quiet chuckle. "You always did like playing with fire. Give me a few hours. I'll call you back." Claire ended the call, her mind racing. She didn't like relying on unofficial sources, but if the system was failing Michael, she had no choice but to look elsewhere. Meanwhile, across town, Lisa Carter pulled Emily away from the window. "Stay away from the curtains, sweetheart." Emily clutched her stuffed rabbit, looking up at her mother with wide eyes. "Mom, who is that?" Lisa forced a smile, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's probably nothing. Just someone parked there." But she didn't believe that. Not for a second. The same car had been outside since the night before. No movement. No driver stepping out. Just waiting. Lisa reached for her phone and called the police. After explaining the situation, the dispatcher assured her that they would send a unit to check it out. 30 minutes later, there was a soft knock at the door. Lisa nearly jumped out of her skin before realizing it was a police officer. She opened the door cautiously. "Ma'am, I checked the vehicle. It's empty." Lisa blinked. "What do you mean, empty?" "There was someone inside. My daughter saw them." "I saw them." The officer hesitated, looking slightly uncomfortable. The engine was cold, and the doors were unlocked. No sign of forced entry. It's like whoever was in there just walked away. A chill ran down Lisa's spine. "Do you want us to tow it?" the officer asked. Lisa swallowed hard. "Yes." "And could you have someone patrol the street tonight?" The officer nodded. "Of course, ma'am. We'll keep an eye out." But deep down, Lisa knew that whoever had been watching them wasn't done yet. Elsewhere, Claire's phone rang. It was Wes. That was fast. His voice was lower this time. "Serious. You're not gonna like what I found." Claire's stomach tightened. "Tell me." There was a brief pause before he spoke. Gregory Barnes was reported missing a week after Michael's arrest. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. "Missing?" "Yeah. But here's the weird part. No investigation. No news coverage. No missing person report filed. It's like he just disappeared and no one cared." That didn't sit right with Claire. Why would a man with a criminal record vanish right after a high-profile murder and no one even mention it? Then, Wes said something that made her blood run cold. "One last thing." "Yeah." The last person to call Gregory Barnes before he disappeared was Detective Harris. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "You're sure?" "Positive. I pulled the records from an old source." Harris called Barnes 2 days after the murder. Claire's head was spinning. This wasn't just a mistake in the investigation. This was something bigger. And if Detective Harris had been covering for Barnes, it meant one thing. Michael Carter's conviction wasn't an accident. It was a setup. Lisa Carter double-checked the locks on the front door, her hands trembling. The police officer had left a few minutes ago, but his words still echoed in her mind. Whoever was in there, they didn't leave in that car. That meant someone had been outside, watching. And now they were somewhere else. Emily sat on the couch, hugging her stuffed rabbit close. She wasn't speaking, just staring at the front door as if waiting for something to happen. Lisa forced a smile, trying to push down the growing fear in her chest. "Everything is fine, sweetheart. Let's go upstairs, okay?" Emily nodded slowly, but as Lisa reached for the light switch, a sound froze her in place. A soft creak came from the back of the house. Lisa's breath hitched. The back door. She grabbed Emily's hand and moved quickly toward the stairs, her pulse racing. Was she imagining things? Had the wind moved something? She wanted to believe that, but deep down, she knew better. Then, another sound. Footsteps. Someone was inside the house. Lisa's instincts kicked in. She pulled Emily up the stairs, rushing into the bedroom. Locking the door behind them, she grabbed her phone with shaky hands and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. Someone's in my house. The operator's tone immediately changed. Stay calm. Are you in a safe location? I locked myself in the bedroom with my daughter. Please, send someone quickly. Officers are on their way. Stay quiet. Do not leave the room. Lisa held Emily close, pressing her back against the door. Seconds felt like hours. Downstairs, something crashed to the floor. Then, silence. Lisa held her breath, her ears straining to hear any movement. The minutes dragged on, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, just an eerie stillness. Then, red and blue lights flashed through the bedroom window. The police had arrived. A knock came at the door. "Ma'am, this is Officer Daniels. You're safe now. You can come out." Lisa hesitated before unlocking the door. She stepped out, still holding Emily tightly, as two officers searched the house. The back door was wide open. Whoever had broken in was gone. And when Lisa checked the living room, she saw something that made her knees go weak. The file containing Emily's testimony, the only proof that she had seen the real killer, was missing. Michael Carter sat in the freezing courtroom, his hands clenched together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. This was it. After months behind bars, after losing everything, this was the moment that would decide if he would finally go home, or if he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Beside him, Claire Jennings flipped through the legal documents one last time, her expression unreadable. Ever since the break-in at Lisa's house, it had become painfully clear. Someone was desperate to silence Emily. But Claire wasn't about to let that happen. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and Vanessa Lowell entered, carrying a thick case file. But something about her was different this time. The usual confidence in her stride was gone, replaced with something uncertain. Claire noticed it immediately. Lowell wasn't here to fight anymore. She was here because she had no choice. Vanessa walked straight up to the judge's bench, handed over the file, and whispered something. The judge skimmed through the pages, his eyes narrowing slightly as he flipped through the evidence. Then, he cleared his throat and banged the gavel once. Due to new evidence presented by the prosecution, this court will now reconsider the verdict of Michael Carter. Michael's breath caught in his throat. New evidence? From the prosecution? He turned slightly toward Claire, but she looked just as stunned as he was. Vanessa Lowell had spent months building a case against him, fighting tooth and nail to put him behind bars. So why was she now bringing in new evidence? Vanessa inhaled sharply before turning to address the court. Her voice was steady, but the usual fire behind it was missing. After reviewing the forensic findings and additional witness testimony, the prosecution concedes that the case against Mr. Carter is no longer viable. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Somewhere, a pen dropped to the floor, the faint sound echoing in the heavy air. Nobody had expected this. Michael felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Was this real? Was she really admitting she was wrong? The judge folded his hands and looked directly at Michael. Given these developments, and with no remaining evidence to support the charges, this court finds the defendant not guilty. Mr. Carter, you are free to go. For a few seconds, Michael couldn't move. His brain struggled to process what had just happened. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with Vanessa Lowell standing in front of him, conceding defeat. Claire placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "It's over, Michael. You're going home." But before he could react, a sudden bang echoed through the courtroom. A door slamming shut. Michael's eyes darted toward the noise, but all he saw was a shadow disappearing into the hallway. And that's when he realized. Not everyone was happy about this outcome. Michael Carter stepped out of the courthouse, inhaling the crisp autumn air for the first time as a free man. The sky above was a dull gray, but to him, it was the most beautiful sight he had seen in months. Cameras flashed all around, reporters shouted questions, but none of it mattered. He was free. Claire Jennings walked beside him, keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. The case had ended, but something still felt unfinished. The slamming door in the courtroom, the shadow disappearing down the hall. Someone wasn't happy about Michael's release. And that unsettled her. Then, from the steps of the courthouse, he saw her. Emily. She was standing with Lisa, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her blue eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on him. The moment she saw her father, she ran. Michael barely had time to react before Emily threw herself into his arms, her small frame trembling as she clung to him. "I knew you didn't do it, Daddy. I knew." His throat tightened as he hugged her back, pressing his lips to her hair. "And I knew you were brave enough to save me." Lisa wiped away a tear as she watched them. The nightmare was finally over. Or so they thought. Across the street, a pair of police cruisers sped into view, their sirens cutting through the noise of the reporters. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn. The crowd hushed as a commotion broke out near a black sedan parked at the curb. Claire's pulse quickened. She knew that car. Seconds later, officers dragged a man out of the vehicle, forcing him onto the ground. His disheveled clothes and wild eyes told the story. He had been hiding, waiting, watching. Michael's grip on Emily tightened. "Gregory Barnes." One of the officers shouted to the others. He was sitting outside with a gun. Looks like he was waiting for someone. Michael felt a wave of nausea hit him. Waiting for him? For Emily? Barnes struggled, his voice hoarse as he snarled at the officers. "You think this is over? You think this is justice? You have no idea what's coming." Claire stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "It's over, Barnes. The truth won." He let out a hollow laugh as they shoved him into the police car. "The truth? You don't even know the half of it." The door slammed shut, and the car pulled away, taking Barnes with it. Michael let out a shaky breath. He looked down at Emily, who was still holding on to him, and kissed the top of her head. "Let's go home." As they walked away from the courthouse, Claire couldn't shake Barnes's final words. "You have no idea what's coming." Was it just the desperate ramblings of a man who had lost everything? Or was there something more? She didn't know. But for now, Michael Carter had his life back. And that was all that mattered.